Isotope analysis performed directly on Neanderthal bone collagen has produced results so heavily skewed toward meat consumption that several specific Neanderthal individuals tested at nitrogen isotope levels comparable to actual apex predators, lions, wolves, hyenas, animals whose entire biological existence revolves around hunting and eating other animals. Not ate a lot of meat for an omnivore, comparable to a wolf. This single piece of evidence alone should completely demolish the lingering popular image of ancient humans nervously nibbling on berries while occasionally getting lucky with a scrap of meat. For an enormous stretch of human evolutionary history, meat wasn't a treat. It was close to the entire operating budget. Let's start with the most basic, most important reason driving this entire pattern: calories. Meat represents an extraordinarily dense, efficient calorie source compared to most plant foods readily available to ancient humans, particularly in temperate and cold climate environments where edible plant options were considerably more limited, especially during winter months when most plants simply weren't producing anything edible at all. A single successful large game kill could provide thousands upon thousands of calories, concentrated into one event, compared to the considerably more labor-intensive process of gathering enough wild plant food to produce anything close to an equivalent caloric return. From a pure energy economic standpoint, meat represented the single most efficient way to acquire enormous quantities of usable energy for the amount of time and effort actually invested. This connects directly to something we've discussed in a previous video regarding ancient eating patterns more broadly. Ancient humans frequently operated under conditions of genuine food scarcity and unpredictability, and a food source capable of delivering an enormous caloric payout in one single, concentrated event represented an enormously valuable survival strategy, regardless of the very real effort and risk involved in actually securing that payout through successful hunting. Now let's bring up something genuinely important regarding fat specifically, because this deserves direct, dedicated attention, since fat played a considerably more central role in ancient meat consumption than most people realize. Modern diet culture has trained an enormous number of people to think of fat as something to minimize or avoid. But for ancient humans, fat represented an absolutely critical, sometimes life or death nutritional priority. Lean meat alone, without sufficient accompanying fat, can actually become dangerous to rely on too heavily, a genuinely documented phenomenon historically referred to as rabbit starvation, where excessive protein intake without adequate fat can overwhelm the liver's capacity to process it, leading to serious illness even while technically consuming enough total calories. This is part of why ancient hunters frequently prioritized targeting fattier animals, or fattier portions of a given animal, organ meats, bone marrow, specific fatty deposits, over simply maximizing total meat quantity regardless of fat content. This actually explains a genuinely fascinating detail found consistently across numerous ancient hunting and butchery sites: evidence of deliberate, careful processing specifically targeting bone marrow extraction. Marrow represents an extraordinarily fat-dense, calorie-rich food source, and the specific tools and techniques ancient humans developed for efficiently cracking open bones to access marrow demonstrate genuinely sophisticated awareness that not all parts of an animal carcass carried equal nutritional value. Ancient hunters weren't simply killing an animal and eating indiscriminately. They were strategically prioritizing the specific parts of that animal carrying the highest nutritional payoff, fat-rich marrow and organ meat representing genuinely prized, deliberately sought components of a successful hunt rather than simple, leftover scraps. Let's bring up something genuinely important connecting this entire topic to brain development now, because this represents one of the most significant, actively researched threads in all of human evolutionary biology. The human brain is an extraordinarily expensive organ from a pure energy standpoint, consuming roughly 20% of the body's total resting energy expenditure despite representing only a small fraction of total body mass. Researchers studying human brain evolution have proposed that the increased availability of dense, easily digestible calories and specific nutrients found in meat, certain essential fatty acids, iron, zinc, vitamin B12, played a genuinely significant role in supporting the dramatic increase in brain size that characterizes our specific evolutionary lineage compared to earlier hominin ancestors. This doesn't mean meat consumption alone single-handedly caused human brain evolution. The actual picture is considerably more complex and involves multiple interacting factors. But the nutritional density meat provided likely represented a genuinely significant contributing piece of the puzzle, helping supply the specific concentrated nutrients an increasingly large, increasingly energy hungry brain actually required to develop and function properly across an organism's entire lifetime. Now let's bring up cooking because we touched on this briefly in a previous video, but it deserves more direct attention specifically in the context of meat consumption. Cooking meat significantly increases the actual digestible calories and protein the human body can extract from it compared to consuming the exact same quantity raw. Cooked meat protein structures become considerably easier for human digestive enzymes to break down efficiently, meaning the development of reliable fire control and cooking technique didn't just make meat taste better or kill harmful pathogens, it genuinely increased the actual usable nutritional value extracted from every single successful hunt, effectively making meat an even more calorically efficient food source than it already was in its raw state. Let's bring up something genuinely fascinating regarding persistence hunting again, because we discussed this strategy in detail in a previous video, but it connects directly and specifically to this entire topic of meat consumption volume. A species capable of successfully running down prey animals through sustained, extended pursuit, rather than relying purely on stealth ambush or scavenging, gains access to considerably more reliable, repeatable meat acquisition compared to a species limited to opportunistic scavenging alone. This hunting capability essentially functioned as the practical mechanism making consistently high meat consumption actually achievable in the first place. All the nutritional motivation in the world doesn't matter if a species lacks the actual physical and strategic capability to reliably acquire that meat, and ancient humans, as we've discussed previously, developed genuinely impressive hunting capability across an enormous range of different specific strategies and environments. Let's bring up something genuinely important regarding regional and environmental variation in this entire topic too, because much like nearly every other ancient human behavior pattern we've covered throughout this series, meat consumption levels almost certainly varied considerably depending on specific environment and available resources, rather than representing one single, universal dietary pattern applied identically everywhere. Populations living in genuinely resource-rich tropical environments, with abundant year-round plant food availability, likely consumed meat at meaningfully different rates compared to populations living in colder, more northern climates, where edible plant options were considerably more limited and seasonal, making meat a considerably larger, more consistently necessary proportion of total caloric intake throughout significant portions of the year. This environmental variation actually helps explain some of the genuinely striking isotope evidence we opened this entire video with. Neanderthal populations specifically inhabited predominantly European environments during periods of considerable cold, environments where edible plant food would have been genuinely scarce for substantial portions of the year, making heavy reliance on meat considerably more of a practical necessity compared to populations living in warmer, more plant-abundant regions. This doesn't mean every single ancient human population ate meat at the same extreme level. Neanderthal isotope data suggests it means specific environmental circumstances pushed certain specific populations toward considerably heavier meat reliance than others, exactly the kind of regionally responsive dietary flexibility we've discussed throughout this entire series. Now let's bring up something genuinely interesting regarding hunting risk and reward calculations specifically, because this connects directly back to a previous video where we discussed why ancient humans largely avoided eating predators. The exact same underlying caloric efficiency logic that explained predator avoidance also explains why large herbivores specifically represented such a heavily prioritized meat source. Herbivores sit lower on the food chain, meaning considerably less energy has been lost through trophic transfer compared to predator meat, making a successful large herbivore kill an exceptionally calorie-dense, nutritionally efficient prize relative to the risk and effort actually required to secure it. This means the heavy meat consumption we're discussing throughout this entire video wasn't simply eating a lot of any available animal. It represented a genuinely strategic, calorically optimized targeting of specific, particularly efficient meat sources. Let's bring up something genuinely important regarding social structure and meat sharing too, because successful large game hunting frequently produced considerably more meat than a single hunter or small family unit could realistically consume before spoilage became a genuine concern, particularly in warmer climates without reliable preservation methods. This created strong, practical incentive toward meat sharing across an entire group. A behavior researchers studying contemporary hunter-gatherer societies have documented extensively. Successful hunters frequently distribute a significant portion of their kill across the broader social group rather than hoarding it exclusively for their own immediate family. This sharing behavior likely served multiple overlapping functions simultaneously, reducing waste from inevitable spoilage, building reciprocal social obligations that provided a meaningful safety net during future periods when that specific hunter's own efforts came up empty, and reinforcing exactly the kind of group cohesion and cooperative social bonding we've discussed throughout numerous previous videos as being absolutely central to ancient human survival strategy. Now let's address something genuinely important worth bringing up directly. Doesn't heavy, sustained meat consumption carry some genuine health risks? The kind modern nutritional science frequently warns about regarding excessive meat intake in contemporary diets? This is a genuinely fair, important question worth addressing carefully rather than glossing over. It's worth noting that ancient meat consumption patterns differed considerably from modern meat consumption in several genuinely significant ways. Ancient meat came from wild game with a meaningfully different fat composition compared to modern grain-fed domesticated livestock. Ancient populations combined heavy meat intake with consistently high physical activity levels, and ancient meat consumption frequently included organ meats and other nutrient-dense components that modern diets, even meat-heavy ones, generally exclude entirely. This means direct, simple comparisons between ancient meat consumption patterns and modern meat-heavy diets require real caution. The specific nutritional and physiological context surrounding ancient meat consumption looked considerably different from the context surrounding most modern meat consumption patterns. Let's bring up something genuinely fascinating regarding skeletal and dental evidence too, because researchers studying ancient human remains have found physical evidence directly supporting the heavy meat consumption patterns we've been discussing throughout this entire video. Dental wear patterns on ancient teeth, along with isotope analysis we already discussed at the very beginning of this video, provide genuinely direct, physical confirmation of diet composition rather than purely theoretical inference based on environmental availability alone. This combination of direct skeletal evidence and broader environmental and behavioral reasoning provides researchers with a genuinely robust, multi-layered body of evidence supporting just how central meat actually was to ancient human survival strategy across numerous different populations and time periods. Let's also bring up something genuinely interesting connecting this entire topic to tool development specifically, because the heavy emphasis on meat acquisition and processing directly shaped a significant portion of ancient tool technology development. Specialized cutting tools for butchery, scrapers specifically designed for processing hide, and increasingly sophisticated projectile technology for improving hunting success rates all represent technological developments directly driven by the practical demands of efficiently acquiring and processing meat at the scale ancient human survival apparently required. This connects directly to something we've discussed throughout multiple previous videos in this series. Ancient technology didn't develop in some kind of abstract, disconnected vacuum. It developed in direct, practical response to specific survival needs, and meat acquisition and processing represented one of the single most significant, consistent drivers of ancient tool innovation across an enormous span of human evolutionary history. Now, let's bring up something genuinely worth addressing regarding the transition away from this heavy, meat-reliant pattern because, much like several other ancient behaviors we've covered throughout this series, this dietary pattern shifted considerably once agriculture became widespread. The development of reliable, storable grain crops, and increasingly sophisticated animal domestication and herding practices gradually provided alternative, more consistently available calorie sources, reducing the absolute necessity of the kind of heavy, meat-dominant diet that characterized earlier hunter-gatherer populations, particularly those living in challenging, resource-scarce environments. This doesn't mean meat consumption disappeared once agriculture developed. Domesticated livestock simply became a more controlled, predictable meat source compared to wild game hunting. But the overall proportion of total caloric intake coming specifically from meat likely shifted considerably as agricultural societies gained access to a broader, more diversified range of reliable food sources beyond what hunting alone could ever consistently provide. Let's bring up something genuinely interesting regarding how this entire topic connects to ongoing modern dietary debates, too, because the historical and biological evidence we've discussed throughout this video frequently gets referenced, sometimes accurately and sometimes considerably less accurately, within contemporary discussions about optimal human diet. It's worth being genuinely careful here. The fact that certain ancient populations, particularly those living in genuinely meat-scarce plant environments like cold climate Neanderthal populations specifically, consumed heavy quantities of meat out of genuine environmental necessity, doesn't automatically translate into a simple, universal claim that heavy meat consumption represents some kind of single, optimal diet for every modern human, regardless of their own specific environment, activity level, and available food options. Ancient dietary patterns were genuinely diverse and genuinely shaped by specific, often quite difficult environmental circumstances, and applying any single ancient dietary pattern as a universal modern prescription requires considerably more nuance than popular dietary discourse frequently allows for. There's also a genuinely interesting angle worth bringing into this discussion involving coastal and aquatic resources specifically, because heavy protein consumption among certain ancient populations didn't always come purely from terrestrial hunting alone. Populations living along coastlines and major river systems frequently developed substantial reliance on fish, shellfish, and other aquatic protein sources, providing many of the same dense caloric and nutritional benefits as terrestrial meat, while carrying considerably different acquisition risks compared to large game hunting. Archaeological sites along numerous ancient coastlines show substantial shell middens, enormous accumulated piles of discarded shellfish remains, demonstrating that aquatic protein represented a genuinely significant, sustained dietary contribution for populations fortunate enough to have reliable access to these specific resources. This adds an important layer of nuance to this entire topic. Heavy meat consumption throughout ancient human history wasn't exclusively about large terrestrial game hunting. It represented a broader pattern of prioritizing dense, reliable animal protein sources generally, adapted to whatever specific resources a given environment happened to make most consistently available. Let's bring up something genuinely important regarding seasonal storage and preservation techniques too, because heavy meat consumption throughout the year, rather than purely during successful hunting events, required ancient populations to develop genuine technical skill around preserving surplus meat for later consumption. Smoking, drying, and in colder climates, simple cold storage using naturally freezing temperatures all represented documented ancient meat preservation techniques, allowing a single successful large hunt to provide usable nutrition across a considerably longer stretch of time than the meat would have remained safely edible without any preservation effort at all. This preservation technology mattered enormously for sustaining heavy meat consumption levels consistently, rather than experiencing extreme feast or famine cycles purely dictated by hunting success on any single given day, reinforcing once again just how much deliberate technical skill and accumulated practical knowledge underpinned what might otherwise look like a simple, straightforward dietary pattern. It's also worth touching on something genuinely fascinating regarding how meat consumption connects to ancient population density and settlement patterns more broadly, because the caloric efficiency of meat, particularly successful large game hunting, likely influenced how ancient groups organized their movement and territory use. Populations relying heavily on hunting large migratory game frequently needed to follow those herds across considerable distances and across specific seasonal patterns, directly connecting back to the migration topic we explored in a previous video. This dependency on tracking and following specific prey populations shaped not just diet, but the entire underlying logic of where and when ancient groups actually chose to move, settle temporarily, or relocate entirely, reinforcing just how deeply interconnected ancient subsistence strategy, mobility, and social organization really were, rather than existing as separate, independent considerations. Now let's bring up something genuinely interesting regarding specific nutrient deficiencies that heavy meat consumption appears to have helped ancient populations avoid, because this provides a genuinely useful, concrete lens for understanding exactly why this dietary pattern mattered so significantly beyond pure caloric efficiency. Iron deficiency, for example, represents a genuinely serious, well documented health risk, particularly for women of reproductive age. And meat provides a form of iron, heme iron, that the human body absorbs considerably more efficiently than the non-heme iron found in plant sources. Vitamin B12 similarly occurs naturally almost exclusively in animal products, with no significant reliable plant source available within most ancient dietary contexts. This means heavy meat consumption wasn't simply providing convenient bulk calories, it was directly supplying specific, otherwise genuinely difficult to obtain essential nutrients that plant-based foods available to most ancient populations simply couldn't adequately provide on their own. Let's also bring up something genuinely worth mentioning regarding how this entire topic connects to comparative research on contemporary hunter-gatherer populations. Because modern ethnographic studies of groups like the Hadza and various Arctic indigenous populations provide genuinely valuable comparative data supporting much of what we've discussed throughout this video. Research on populations maintaining traditional, high meat content diets in modern times has documented generally favorable cardiovascular and metabolic health markers, despite consuming meat at levels that would likely raise immediate concern within typical modern dietary guidelines designed primarily around the very different nutritional and activity context of contemporary industrialized populations. This comparative evidence reinforces something worth repeating directly from earlier in this video. Context matters enormously when evaluating dietary patterns, and the specific combination of high physical activity, whole animal consumption including organ meats, and the complete absence of the heavily processed foods that dominate most modern diets likely explains much of the difference between how heavy ancient meat consumption functioned nutritionally compared to how a similarly meat-heavy modern diet might actually play out today. So why did ancient humans eat so much meat? Based on everything we've covered throughout this entire video, the honest, complete answer comes down to a genuinely compelling combination of caloric efficiency, nutritional density, and practical environmental necessity. Meat provided an extraordinarily concentrated, efficient calorie source compared to most available plant alternatives, particularly critical in colder, more seasonally limited environments. Fat specifically, frequently obtained through deliberate, strategic targeting of organ meat and bone marrow, provided essential nutrients that lean meat alone simply couldn't supply. The increasing availability of meat-derived nutrients likely played a genuinely significant supporting role in supporting humanity's dramatic brain development across our evolutionary history. And the specific hunting capabilities, persistence hunting, sophisticated tool development, and cooperative social structures we've discussed throughout this entire series made consistently acquiring this kind of meat-heavy diet genuinely achievable rather than simply theoretically advantageous. And honestly, maybe the most genuinely interesting thing to take away from this entire topic is recognizing just how directly meat consumption connects to nearly every other major thread we've explored throughout this entire series: persistence hunting capability, tool development, fire and cooking technology, social cooperation and food sharing, and even the development of the very brain capable of eventually asking why any of this happened in the first place. Heavy meat consumption wasn't some isolated, standalone dietary quirk of ancient human behavior. It represented one of the central, interconnected threads running directly through nearly every major survival strategy our species developed across an enormous span of evolutionary history, quietly shaping our physical capability, our technology, our social structure, and ultimately, the very brain now sitting here, considerably better fed and considerably less likely to need to chase down dinner, processing this exact sentence.